At first glance, Apple seems like the perfect corporation: sleek, clean, ethical. From its minimalist design to its tightly scripted product launches, the tech giant has cultivated a brand that whispers innovation, elegance, and integrity. But behind the polished exterior lies a different story, one that starts not in Silicon Valley, but in a grey office building in Cork, Ireland. This is where the real Apple empire begins. Not in Cupertino, not in the Genius Bar, not in the glowing temples of Apple stores around the globe, but in a nondescript financial office where legal loopholes, phantom subsidiaries, and offshore strategies are quietly managed, all for one purpose: to avoid taxes. Apple calls it efficiency, but the world is beginning to see it for what it really is: evasion on a global scale. The story goes back to the early 1980s, when Apple was still just a scrappy computer company. Even then, its executives were already thinking globally. Ireland, with its low corporate tax rate and business-friendly environment, became an ideal staging ground. Apple Operations International (AOI), a now infamous subsidiary, was born here on paper. AOI had no employees, no physical office, no real operations. Yet this ghost company would eventually hold over $100 billion in profits, all of it parked outside the United States, all of it untaxed. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand how Apple engineered its financial structure. The key was in the intellectual property, Apple's crown jewel. By assigning rights to sell Apple products in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia to a handful of Irish subsidiaries, Apple ensured that profits from iPhones, iPads, and Macs sold across the globe would be booked in Ireland, not in the countries where the sales actually occurred. This structure, known in tax avoidance circles as the double Irish, relied on a clever manipulation of residency rules. One Irish subsidiary was technically based in Ireland, but was considered a resident of no country for tax purposes. Another, also Irish by incorporation, funneled payments to offshore accounts in Bermuda, where corporate income is taxed at 0%. The effect: Apple paid virtually no taxes on hundreds of billions of dollars in profits. Between 2009 and 2012, Apple funneled $74 billion through its Irish subsidiaries, while paying little more than 2% in taxes on those earnings. In some years, the effective rate was less than 1%. This isn't a fringe conspiracy. In 2013, the United States Senate summoned Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, to testify before Congress. There, under oath, Cook admitted that Apple does not rely on tax gimmicks. But investigators quickly revealed that the company had established a shadow network of entities designed to dodge both US and international taxes. Senator Carl Levin, chairing the investigation, didn't mince words. Apple has sought the holy grail of tax avoidance, he said. It has created offshore entities that it argues are not resident in any nation, and therefore owe no taxes to any government. The scale of this avoidance was unprecedented. Apple's cash pile offshore grew larger than the GDP of many countries, and all of it, every dollar, was beyond the reach of the IRS, thanks to legal gymnastics. But Apple didn't stop at Ireland. As international pressure began mounting, Apple turned to another jurisdiction: Jersey. A tiny island in the English Channel, Jersey has no corporate income tax for most companies. When the Irish government, under pressure from the European Union, announced that it would begin closing the double Irish loophole, Apple seamlessly shifted its financial strategy. Leaked documents from the Paradise Papers in 2017 exposed Apple's secret move. The company had asked Appleby, an offshore law firm, to find a new tax haven that would allow it to maintain its low effective rate. Jersey was the answer. Apple's new offshore entities were reincorporated in Jersey, and the profits continued to flow. Billions of dollars were routed through these paper companies again, without ever being taxed where the money was actually earned. Apple claims that it pays every dollar it owes in taxes, and technically that's true. But the entire system has been rigged in Apple's favor. Tax laws written in an era before global digital empires have not kept pace, and Apple's army of lawyers, accountants, and lobbyists have exploited every gap. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens, small businesses, and public services are left picking up the tab. Hospitals are underfunded, schools are overcrowded, infrastructure crumbles, And one of the most profitable companies in the history of capitalism is parking its treasure offshore, protected by shell companies and secrecy. The Apple tax strategy has become a blueprint. Other tech giants, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, have followed suit, establishing similar networks of subsidiaries to dodge their obligations. But Apple remains the master. It's a system built on illusion, the illusion of transparency, the illusion of legality, the illusion of moral high ground. But in the shadows of that illusion, billions vanish, not stolen but redirected, not illegal but unjust. And it's all happening with a smile under a glowing Apple logo. Follow the money. That's what investigators always say. And when you follow Apple's money, not the product revenues or retail sales, but the capital that never made it home, you start to realize something staggering. This isn't just about accounting tricks. It's about power, influence, and control over the very laws that are supposed to regulate them. By 2014, Apple had parked more than $200 billion in offshore subsidiaries, not hidden in Swiss bank accounts, not in vaults buried under sand, but in broad daylight, visible to regulators, untaxed, unclaimed, and legally protected. This war chest gave Apple something far more valuable than product dominance. It gave the company leverage. That same year, the European Commission launched an investigation into Apple's tax arrangements in Ireland. The preliminary findings were damning. Apple, it said, had received illegal state aid from Ireland. The company had negotiated sweetheart deals that allowed it to pay as little as 0.05% in corporate tax, effectively nothing. European Commissioner Margrethe Vestager stood at the podium and said what the world already suspected: Apple was allowed to pay substantially less tax than other businesses. This is illegal under EU state aid rules. The ruling ordered Apple to pay $13 billion in back taxes. It was a historic penalty, and Apple refused. Tim Cook responded with a blistering open letter. The decision he wrote was total political crap. Apple claimed it had done nothing wrong, that it was being targeted for its success. But behind the PR war, a different campaign was unfolding, one waged by Apple's lobbyists. In Washington, D.C., Apple ramped up spending. In 2015 alone, it spent over $4.5 million on lobbying, most of it focused on one goal: tax reform. More specifically, Apple wanted a tax holiday, a one-time repatriation rate that would allow it to bring its overseas cash home at a heavily discounted rate. In public, Apple executives talked about jobs and investment, but in private they were rewriting the rules. The result, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. The act slashed the US corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. But more importantly for Apple, it included a one-time repatriation deal. Offshore earnings would be taxed at a mere 15.5% or lower, depending on how the assets were held. Apple took the deal. In 2018, it repatriated nearly $250 billion in offshore cash, paying a fraction of what it would have under the old rules. It was the largest repatriation in US history. But Apple didn't use that money to build new factories or create jobs as it had promised. Instead, it used it to buy back its own stock, over $100 billion worth in just 1 year. Shareholders rejoiced. The value of Apple stock soared. And the company's executives were rewarded handsomely thanks to stock-based compensation packages. Meanwhile, the $13 billion fine in Ireland remained unpaid. Apple and the Irish government appealed the decision, arguing that the EU was overstepping its authority. For years, the case dragged on. Apple parked the money in an escrow account untouched. And the legal battle became a symbol of something bigger: the power of multinational corporations to challenge governments, not just in backrooms, but in courtrooms. As Apple flexed its financial muscle, other countries took notice. France, Italy, and Australia launched their own investigations. The G7 and G20 began pushing for global tax reform. OECD proposals for a minimum corporate tax rate gained traction. But Apple and its peers didn't just sit back. They adapted. New subsidiaries were established. New rules were quietly lobbied into law. And always the cash flowed minimized, redirected, optimized to perfection. The corporate tax departments at Apple weren't just reactive. They were strategic units designing global architectures of evasion. In the United States, Apple joined forces with other tech giants to form lobbying coalitions. They fought efforts to close loopholes, arguing that any increase in tax rates would harm innovation. And while politicians debated reform, Apple continued its ascent to becoming the world's first $3 trillion company. But the real brilliance of Apple's strategy wasn't just in what it avoided, it was in what it redefined. The company had changed the meaning of profit. Through transfer pricing, internal licensing fees, and cost-sharing agreements, Apple could shift income across borders with the stroke of a pen. An iPhone sold in Paris might register its profit in Cork. A service fee collected in Tokyo could land in Jersey. The web was invisible to consumers, but perfectly legal under international law. Even more dangerous was the way this system shaped government behavior. Countries competed not to regulate Apple but to attract it. Ireland refused to collect the EU fine. The US slashed tax rates. Jersey welcomed shell corporations. The entire game was rigged around keeping Apple happy, hoping it might bring some jobs, some prestige, or a slice of its wealth. This is not the free market. It's state capture by stealth. And Apple isn't alone. It's just the most sophisticated player in the arena. What began as clever accounting had become something else entirely, a global arms race of tax avoidance, where the prize is not just money, but sovereignty itself. To understand the cost of Apple's tax strategy, we need to go beyond spreadsheets, beyond balance sheets and quarterly earnings. We need to look at what happens when a trillion-dollar company removes billions from the global economy and refuses to pay its fair share. Start with the fundamentals. Taxes pay for public goods. Roads, schools, hospitals, infrastructure, legal systems, the very environment in which Apple is able to design, manufacture, and sell its products. When Apple engineers sit in Cupertino working on the next generation of devices, they're not doing so in a vacuum. They're protected by patent laws, public research, grants, a highly educated workforce, all funded by taxpayers. But Apple's contribution back into that system is vanishingly small. In the United States, the effective corporate tax rate has plummeted over the decades. Apple, despite being one of the most profitable companies in the world, has paid as little as 8% in some years, far below the statutory rate. Globally, it's even worse. In countries where Apple operates but doesn't declare profits, the damage is staggering. Take France. Apple generates billions in sales from French consumers, but pays a tiny fraction in taxes there. The rest is routed through Irish subsidiaries. In 2016, French authorities raided Apple's offices in Paris as part of a tax fraud investigation. The outcome: Apple quietly paid $500 million in back taxes. No admission of guilt, no systemic change. But this isn't just about Europe. Developing countries bear the heaviest burden. These nations, already struggling with limited healthcare, underfunded education, and fragile infrastructure, are often the most dependent on corporate tax revenue. Yet they're precisely the countries that Apple and others avoid declaring profit in. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Apple has a strong consumer base, often growing faster than in the West. But the profits from iPhone sales don't stay there. They're funneled out through digital transactions, booked elsewhere, and shielded from local taxation. The result: entire generations grow up with iPhones in their pockets, but without clean water or working hospitals. In Zambia, for example, where over 50% of the population lives in poverty, the corporate tax base is essential. Yet the country loses more in tax avoidance by multinationals than it receives in foreign aid. The irony is brutal. Rich countries send aid with one hand, while their corporations extract wealth with the other. And the tools of this extraction are shockingly sophisticated. Apple's tax team employs the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich, a now infamous structure that exploits loopholes in Irish and Dutch law. Here's how it works. Intellectual property rights are assigned to a subsidiary in Ireland. Profits from global sales are routed there. But because of a special agreement with the Irish government, the entity is considered non-tax resident, allowing profits to flow to a shell company in Bermuda, where there's no corporate tax. To avoid direct transfer, money is first funneled through the Netherlands, hence the sandwich. This structure was so effective that by 2013, Apple had accumulated over $100 billion in offshore profits, money it couldn't bring back to the US without paying a high tax rate, which is why it lobbied so hard for the tax holiday we discussed in Part 2. Meanwhile, governments, especially in Europe, began waking up. Protests erupted in cities like Dublin, Paris, and Milan. Citizens were furious. In austerity-ridden economies where hospitals were closing and pensions were being cut, Apple was sitting on mountains of untaxed wealth. In Greece, Apple's tax practices became a symbol of injustice. While everyday citizens were forced to pay emergency levies and endure wage reductions, multinationals operated with near impunity. The message was clear: if you're rich enough, the rules don't apply. And yet Apple maintained its brand. The company continued to run sleek ads about sustainability, community, and social responsibility. It positioned itself as the champion of privacy, of equity, of the think different ethos. But the truth was darker. In private, Apple's strategies were draining the very communities it claimed to support. A report by the Tax Justice Network estimated that global tax avoidance by multinationals costs governments over $500 billion a year. Apple alone is responsible for a significant portion of that sum. And while that number is staggering, the real cost can't be measured in dollars. It's measured in lost futures, in children who never got vaccinated because hospitals were underfunded, in students who dropped out because schools had no teachers, in roads that never got repaired, in entire economies destabilized by the race to the bottom in corporate taxation. It's measured in trust, the trust that citizens place in institutions, in fairness, in justice. And as that trust erodes, something else takes its place: cynicism. The belief that the system is rigged, that laws are optional, that honesty is for suckers. And when that belief becomes widespread, democracies begin to fray. So we return to Apple not just as a company, but as a case study, a mirror, a litmus test for what happens when profit becomes detached from responsibility. As the sun rises over Silicon Valley, it shines on one of the most powerful companies in human history. Apple's headquarters, Apple Park, is a marvel of engineering and design. But beneath the gleaming glass, beneath the eco-friendly marketing, lies a machine engineered not only to innovate, but to shield billions from public accountability. The question now isn't how Apple got here, we've seen that. The question is, will they ever be held to account? Let's start with the biggest attempt so far. In August 2016, the European Commission dropped a bombshell. After years of investigation, it ruled that Ireland had granted Apple illegal state aid through sweetheart tax deals. The conclusion: Apple owed Ireland $13 billion in unpaid taxes plus interest. It was the single largest tax penalty ever levied against a company. But the response was anything but straightforward. Rather than embracing the windfall, the Irish government, yes, the supposed beneficiary, fought the ruling. Why? Because Ireland's economy is deeply entangled with multinationals. It feared that enforcing the penalty would scare off investment and unravel the tax haven model that had fueled its tech boom. In an extraordinary twist, both Apple and Ireland appealed the ruling. Years of legal wrangling followed. In 2020, the European General Court sided with Apple, annulling the Commission's decision. The ruling didn't deny the existence of the tax arrangements, but claimed the Commission hadn't proven they were illegal. The case is still under appeal. But it showed something chilling. Even the EU, the most powerful economic bloc in the world, struggled to hold Apple accountable. And the United States even worse. Despite public outrage, bipartisan rhetoric and investigations, real reform has been glacial. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act slashed the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% and gave Apple a one-time repatriation holiday, allowing it to bring back overseas profits at a steeply discounted rate. Apple responded by announcing job creation and buybacks. But the real impact, a massive reward for offshore hoarding. The IRS, meanwhile, remains underfunded and politically constrained. A 2022 report revealed that audit rates for large corporations have plummeted, while scrutiny of low-income taxpayers has remained disproportionately high. The message power protects power, yet pressure is mounting. Globally, a new consensus is emerging. In 2021, over 130 countries signed on to a landmark agreement under the OECD to set a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. The goal: to stop the race to the bottom and curb profit shifting. If enforced effectively, It could strike at the heart of Apple's tax strategy. But the devil is in the details. Loopholes remain, enforcement is murky, and lobbying is fierce. Apple, alongside other tech giants, is already working behind the scenes to shape the outcome. In Washington, it maintains one of the most sophisticated lobbying operations in existence. Former policymakers now work for Apple. Former Apple lawyers advise governments. The revolving door spins endlessly. Meanwhile, activists are stepping up. Across the world, citizen groups are exposing tax injustice. NGOs like Tax Justice Network and Oxfam are publishing scathing reports. Grassroots protests are calling for accountability. In France, Italy, Brazil, and India, lawsuits are multiplying. The idea that a trillion-dollar company can profit off public goods without paying into them is facing a reckoning, and Apple, to its credit, is adapting cosmetically. It's publishing sustainability reports, investing in green energy, diversifying supply chains, donating to education. It paints a picture of benevolence, of social consciousness. But behind the PR curtain, the core playbook remains intact. Because here's the hard truth: Apple's tax practices aren't a glitch. They're a feature. They're baked into the system. And that system was built by design by policymakers, lobbyists, and legal architects who knew exactly what they were doing. Apple didn't break the law. It helped write the law. So what now? There are three possible futures. Future 1. Nothing changes. Governments remain fragmented. Loopholes persist. Apple continues its global dominance. Its cash mountain grows, and the tax burden falls on small businesses and ordinary citizens. Future 2. Superficial change. A global minimum tax is implemented, but riddled with exceptions. Apple adjusts its structures, finds new havens, and the system continues just with a new coat of paint. Future 3. Real reform. Public pressure forces coordinated global action. Laws are rewritten. Tax havens are shut down. Transparency becomes mandatory, and companies like Apple are finally forced to pay what they owe. But this third future won't happen on its own. It requires courage from politicians, from regulators, from voters. It requires transparency. And above all, it requires a shift in values from blind admiration of wealth to a deeper commitment to justice. Because what's at stake isn't just tax revenue. It's the social contract, the belief that we all play by the same rules, that no one, not even the richest company in the world, is above the law. And in that battle, Apple stands at the center, not just as a tech giant, but as a symbol of a deeper truth. That in the modern economy, wealth and power have found ways to escape responsibility. But perhaps, just perhaps, that era is coming to an end. And maybe we are the ones who will end it.